years. I co-founded the World Agility Forum. Fun fact about myself is I used to be a private pilot. I was a private pilot for about 25 years. And that airplane you see in the upper right-hand corner, I flew it across the Atlantic twice, both times from North America to Europe. And as we get through this talk, maybe you'll see a little bit where how that's influenced my thinking about certain challenges. My day job is I'm a certified Scrum trainer, which I see is about bringing joy and common sense, and by the way, more effective work to organizations. And that mysterious QR code that you see in the lower right-hand corner, if you want to scan that, it will take you to my LinkedIn page. So if you'd like to stay in contact with me afterwards, I'd be honored to return the connection. I'd like to start out with a question. Okay, so we've talked about VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, etc. And the COVID crisis is kind of the perhaps the ultimate VUCA case. So what I'd like to invite you to do is kind of take a moment, reflect. Where were you when the lockdown came? Okay. The lockdown here came very suddenly, and it was a big shock to a lot of people, including myself. Maybe you saw it coming like a rolling wave. Maybe you were kind of wondering if the politicians involved were ever going to make the decision. It's very, very different from case to case. Where were you when the lockdown order came? And how are you feeling at the moment that it came? For me, I was giving a class that day in what we now call an executive-led agile transformation. The gentleman on immediately on my right, or at the left as you're looking at it on the screen, is Joe Justice, who you'll be hearing from a little bit later today. And it's 3 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. Joe is visiting from Japan in Switzerland with his significant other. And Friday afternoon, they started closing everything down on basically zero notice. And so there are all sorts of interesting questions floating around, like, will he be able to fly home? Okay, he had originally planned to spend, I don't know, a week or so skiing and then, continue on for various other options. But, obviously that changed everything. And this is where, you kind of start to feel that moment of chaos, and things that seem ordinary and everyday, they change. Okay, so let's think about how shopping for food might change depending on the situation. Okay, so a lot of trips, at least the trips that I make to the grocery store, are quite routine. Every week we need to get milk. Actually, the way my son drinks milk, a bit more often than that. So we get milk. We get oatmeal. We get cat food. We get, I don't know, the things that you get, and you don't have to think too much about to do it. We'll call that simple. Now, every once in a while, my wife and I will decide to do something a little bit special. So for instance, a couple of weeks ago or a week ago now, we decided to make some American-style French onion soup. In case you're wondering why I say American style, well, the American style has got a lot more cheese on top of it. And so, this isn't something we make very often. So, we had to go dig up the recipe and then figure out, find out what the ingredients are, make sure that we have them, go out and buy them. Okay. Now, basically what we need is knowable. Okay. And there are a lot of things that you need to know about it. And you also get to spend a lot of time chopping onions. Small impediment is how do you deal with the tearing caused by the onions, but basically this problem is mostly knowable. Now, what happens if you have guests coming over? Well, now the situation is a little different. You say, oh, wow, we would love to do something really special. So we are going to do Swiss cheese fondue, okay? And our specialty, kind of our integrated Swiss American version, is we do bacon. And so you fry bacon on the pan, put it between the potato and the cheese, and you get something that's really amazing. Sounds wonderful. Our guests show up and they say, oh man, that's really great what you did, but I'm allergic to cheese and my husband's a vegetarian. Oh, so maybe you've heard the concept of a technical success. The cooking staff did a great job, but they missed key requirements, okay? Now here we're getting into the realm of complexity, okay? Where the unknowns start to dominate. Okay, and in this case, you can't really create the right dinner, until you know what your stakeholders, or in this case, your guests, what they actually want to eat. Now, when we get into a really chaotic situation, so like here it's snowing in Switzerland. Imagine you have an avalanche and the valley's cut off, or in the case of the shutdown for the first COVID crisis, we're wondering, hey, is there going to be food in the stores next week? Okay, and so in a chaotic situation, your shopping is now completely different because you're saying, is there going to be bread on the shelf tomorrow? Well, I'm going to take that last one. And in fact, my wife, she was very proud of the fact she went out shopping and she wanted to get a garlic clove. Okay, she used garlic. She loves garlic. We use it for a number of things. She got to the section in the vegetable stand where there were where garlic should have been, and there wasn't any. And she says, "Oh my God, there's got to be garlic." And she was looking closely, and then she started taking the stand apart, and she found that one garlic clove had fallen onto the floor. It was invisible, and she got it, and she was so proud of that. Okay, so this is dealing with things in a chaotic situation. Okay, and how your situation is influences very heavily how you're going to think about it. Okay, now we of course did what you always do. We stocked up on life's essentials. Now I live in Switzerland, so you might not be familiar with the brands. The package on the left, that's toilet paper. The two boxes in the middle are two different kinds of beer. Then we have pasta, and then we have bottled water. So, all of life's essentials should keep us good for at least a week or two. And once we got through that, then we started to think about, okay, well, what's really happening with the situation? So what I'd like to do is I'd like to talk to you about how do we navigate, how do we find our course, how do we find purpose and meaning and the ability to move forward, and how do we deal with the challenges of what we call the VUCA world. So what I'd like to do is, first of all, take a look at VUCA and agility. Probably, everybody and their brother has explained what VUCA means, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I'd like to share some thoughts about agility. I want to talk about risks and risk management, okay? Because, all of our efforts are there to reduce the risk of people unmuting themselves during the call. No, actually, we're trying to manage the risks of the projects that we're doing, okay? And I would like to ask someone to do some muting now because we're getting crosstalk here. How do we, what are the risks involved and how do we reduce them, okay? And finally, what I'd like to do is look at how do we apply agility, and in particular personal agility, in pretty much any context, not just a Scrum or a Kanban context, but really any context to master the challenges that a VUCA world presents to us. So let's get started with VUCA and agility. So what is VUCA? Well, I mean, by now you've heard the you've heard what the acronym stands for. The first is volatility. Okay, and we get these nice little sine waves. And if we look at volatility in the stock market, a stable stock, it doesn't change very often and it doesn't change very much. A volatile stock changes frequently and you have these wide swings. Okay, so that's volatility. Uncertainty. Well, uncertainty is not knowing what the right answer is, not knowing what's going to happen. Complexity. Now, it's interesting. When I read the literature, I kind of refreshed on it. And there's some difference between what we would call complicated, which is there are lots of moving pieces and you don't really, it's kind of hard to know how they work, but it's mostly knowable, versus complexity, where you've got feedback and interaction. So like the question of if we build the product, we can't know if the customer wants it until they've seen it. It's just not knowable in advance. And so complexity is starting to get into dealing with the unknowns. And then finally, ambiguity. Okay. Now, did anybody notice the question I asked you at the beginning was a little bit ambiguous? Okay. I asked, what do you do and who do you do it for? Now, there are at least two ways to interpret that who do you do it for. You could talk about it in the context of your employer, but you could also think about it in terms of your customer. Why am I here? Who is the beneficiary of the work that I do? And after the fact, you could argue, you could make a good case either way. Did I mean your employer or did I mean your customer? And so this is ambiguous, and this means that we got to figure things out, and we're not even sure that we're asking the right question, much less have understood the answer correctly, as we move forward. Now, what does this have to do with agility? Well, most of what we talk about under VUCA, I would put under the context the more general term of complexity. I think ambiguity and uncertainty, it's all about complexity. It's all about the unknowables, the things you can't know when you're getting started. And the Agile move, or the software development as an industry, was confronted with complexity much earlier and much harder than the rest of the world, because they were the first people building products for the internet, and the internet, with its faster communication and immediate feedback, is just making everything go faster and faster. Now, I saw this picture on LinkedIn actually for the first time the day before yesterday. I think it's a little bit older than that. How do you explain agility to your top management when they don't even have time to comprehend it? Think of a highway. Okay, you've made a plan. You've gone to Google Maps to say to get from A to B. Okay, and then something happens to block the highway. So what do? Do you stay with the map that you printed out before you left, or do you say, well, there might be another way? Okay, now agility is about reacting to impediments, reacting to problems, usually through some kind of innovation. What's interesting, though, is, if any of you have experience driving with a so-called backseat driver, that conversation about should we change from route 1 to route 2, that's not necessarily an easy one. And so this is where we see that the collaboration is also a part of agility, so that you work like teams. Now, if we come back to aviation, they call this cockpit resource management, CRM, and this is how the captain and the co-pilot, regardless of which one is the flying pilot at that moment in time, how they coordinate with each other effectively, even in times of high stress and high uncertainty. Okay, so it's about the collaboration, and this takes us to what most of us think of when we talk about agile or agility today. The term was really coined by the manifesto that was written almost 20 years ago. And I'd like to put in a plug for the Agile 20 Reflect Festival, which is going to be taking February of this year. Believe it or not, the Agile Manifesto is going to be 20 years old. I was really surprised to discover that my daughter is only slightly younger than the Agile Manifesto. That's kind of a scary thought. Now, a lot of people, we have a lot of conversations about this thing called the Agile mindset, and you have to be Agile. And what is this Agile mindset? And I think it's actually staring in the face, but no one's noticed it because it's hiding there in plain sight. And so I'd like to share that with you. If we look at the first sentence of the manifesto, which I've printed here, and you look at the first the first principle in the 12 principles. Okay, so what is that first sentence? Let's take a closer look at it. We're uncovering better ways, and let's ignore that software part for a minute. Let's just call that doing what we do by doing it and helping others do it. Our highest priority is to satisfy the customer. Okay, we can kind of ignore the rest of that too, although they do talk about early and continuous delivery. And that's also kind of hinting at the challenges that we have in a volatile environment. Uncovering better ways is about learning. Helping others to do it, helping each other to do it. I had a long talk with Alistair Coburn about this at the Experience Agile in Lisbon, and he explained they saw themselves as archaeologists discovering things, and we're all down here in the dirt. There are no gurus on high, there are just practitioners doing things and helping each other to do it. So learning and collaboration on a peer-to-peer basis. And finally, our highest priority is purpose. Now, in a commercial context, that's usually about customers. There are a couple of exceptions to that. But what's interesting about if you're an agilist, if you're doing things in an agile way, you not only know what you're doing, you know why you're doing it. Okay, and I think that these three components, okay, learning, collaboration, purpose. This is, to me, what summarizes the agile mindset, and this is what we're all trying to learn. And actually, when you look at it, it's logical. It doesn't need a lot of convincing, but sometimes you need to discover what it means for you so that you see the benefit in it. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about the problem that agility was designed to solve. Okay, and so I'd like to look at risks and kind of, how do you know how big a risk is? And you can tell that I come from Zurich because, Zurich is the home of the Swiss banks. And so that means we talk a lot about money. And at the Lean Agile Scrum Conference in Zurich a couple of years ago, they invited an investment banker to talk about risk. And this is how he described risk. So you take a position, in this case, like an option, you buy the option. So what happens? Well, two things are doing. One, you're taking a position. You're making an assumption about how the world is going to develop. and you're betting money on it. Okay, so that money goes out. And then that option that has a period that you hold it for. Now, that's the expiration date, but you could sell the option. You could do other transactions before that, but basically you hold that option for a certain period. So what is your risk? Okay, well, if your assumptions are correct, you're going to make money, potentially a substantial multiple of what you invested, and that's what the attraction of options. On the other hand, if your assumptions are wrong, you lose. Your investment is gone. Okay, it's a non-trivial problem. Now, the risk from the point of view of an investment banker really depends on two things. Okay, the first is the longer the duration, the more risk you have. The second is the more money you have at risk, that is the bigger your investment, also the more risk that you have. Now, this kind of points out to our first problem. Okay, our organizations have their own rhythms for things like planning and decision making. What happens if the rhythm of planning and decision making is slower than the volatility in the world? Okay, so if we look at this picture, we see that the risks going up and down. And what we see is that the risks are going up and down faster than we can act. And that leaves us in a very difficult position. And I actually, when I'm looking at what's happening to the spread of COVID and the challenges that we're having in keeping it under control, I think a big problem is really that our methods for recognizing what the situation is and doing things about it are much too slow compared to how fast the virus spreads. Okay, so if we find ourselves in this situation with slow decision-making process in a fast-moving market, we have a problem. So how do we reduce risk? Okay, and again, I'm coming from the point of view of the investment banker. There are basically two things that you can do. The first thing you can do is you can shorten the duration that you hold the risk for. Okay, so instead of taking an option for that expires 3 months from now, you do one that expires a month from now or even a week from now. The other thing you can do is you can reduce your financial commitment. Now, when we do things in the real economy as opposed to the financial economy, for instance, developing products, our financial commitment is mostly dependent on the size of the project, that is how many people are involved, multiplied by the duration of the project. So in other words, by shortening the duration of the project, we reduce the financial risk. Okay, and this is where we start to see why Agile systems or Agile frameworks work the way they do. Now, I'm not sure if Scrum was the first approach to do this. It was certainly one of the first modern approaches, probably up there with extreme programming, that said, okay, let us introduce the concept of iterations. Let's introduce the concept of time boxing. So it used to be you would develop a product and it could be years before you expected to see anything come out. And usually the last step was something called integration, which often would throw the project, 2 years back. Okay, so it was very, very difficult. What Scrum did is said, let's introduce a constraint. That constraint is from, formulating our vision, what are we going to achieve in this mini project, we called it a sprint, to having something we can show our customers or stakeholders, maximum 30 days. You say, wait a minute, but we can't do very much in 30 days. Yes, that's true. You can't do very much in 30 days, but you can do some things in 30 days. Okay, and so what that means is you're going to have to iterate. Okay, but what that also means is that every 30 days, at least that often, maybe more often, you're going to have something that you can show to your stakeholders, maybe ship to your customers, maybe test in the marketplace, but you're going to have something concrete and tangible. Okay, now, as I've talked to senior management about, what does Scrum mean for them? And by the way, if you're doing your transformation right, the members of the board will be explaining it to you, the Agile coach, not the other way around. I said, well, this is actually really cool because every month we have a planning. At the end of the month, we have a review. But before we do a planning, we've got something concrete in our hands and we can make very fine-grained decisions about what brings us value and what doesn't. And if the world has changed, what we thought brings us value doesn't bring us value, well, we can change our mind and do something differently. So it gives you a much better ability to manage the risk. Okay. And what I've just described here has the huge advantage that it takes away two key risks, or it takes one away entirely if you do it the way it's envisioned here, and dramatically reduces the other. Okay. The one it eliminates entirely is delivery risk. Are you going to have something at the end of the project? Because if you delivered something last month, you could almost surely deliver something this month. Okay. So you basically go all the way back to the beginning. Every sprint produces something that you could ship, you could bring to your customers or stakeholders. And this frequent validation with your stakeholders, and stakeholder doesn't just mean top management. It also means, users, customers, um, support people, other experts, people who understand what it is you're trying to create. Okay, so you're mitigating market risk and you're virtually eliminating delivery risk, and that is, kind of the number one and number two risk from the top, from the point of view of your stakeholders. Okay, so Scrum pioneered this, and this works great in a software development context. It works in other contexts as well. One of the key criteria, though, is that you're working in a team. Okay. Now, what if you're not working in a team? So what I'd like to do with the rest of the talk is give you some ideas and some tips. How could you apply agility, and in particular personal agility, to any context, regardless of what you're doing, to master the challenges of a VUCA world? So I'm going to give you 5 tips. Okay. Um, First one is you're the captain of the ship. We're going to talk about coaching, how you can do more of what matters and less of what doesn't. It turns out this concept of what really matters scales extremely well for leading large organizations, for creating alignment, which is the holy grail of many organizations. Focus will help you with speed, will make you more responsive and able to handle more volatile situations. And finally, I'd like to remind you to be nice to yourself. Okay, and I'll explain why in a moment. So let's start with the beginning. Whose boat is it? Now, this is a metaphor that we use for achieving long-term goals. I'd like you to imagine for a moment that you are the captain of a sailing ship. You're going from Western Europe to Jamaica. And we're back in the days before there was GPS and radio navigation and all these fun things that you just have to turn on the computer. And it comes up and lights up and tells you where you are and where you're going. How did we do this before? Well, if you wanted to get to a faraway destination, what you would do is you would calculate your course. Okay, so you would say, well, this is how we're going to get there. Okay, then you would set sail. Okay, and every once in a while you would take your position. How did you do that? Well, at the time you needed a clock to know what time it is. You looked at what stars came over the horizon at sunset. You looked at where the North Pole was using a sextant. You looked at where the sun is, etc., and you could figure out your position. And then you compare your position to what you calculated your course to be, and you get one of two situations. Either you're on course and all is good, or you're off course and need to make a correction. And speaking, I've never sailed over the ocean in a boat like this, but speaking as a pilot who has flown over the ocean, this is exactly what you do all the time. You cross-check your current position, make sure that you're on course. If you're drifting off course, you get back on course. Okay, so let's talk about that VUCA world. What happens if you get caught in a storm? Okay, remember, I'd like you to imagine that's a sailing boat. Okay, that's a pretty little boat, and boy, those waves are significant compared to the size of the boat. And I could imagine that the captain of that boat is really busy right now, and his first priority is to keep the boat from sinking. And in fact, you look at all the clouds and the fog and the rain, can he even see the stars? No navigation. Okay, so basically, rule number 1, don't let the boat sink. Okay, if the boat sinks, game over. That's generally considered to be a bad thing. Now, sooner or later, that storm is going to pass. Oh, by the way, what does the storm represent? Well, this is everything that's urgent. This is your customer calling. This is your manager walking in with something that absolutely positively has to be done by 5 o'clock tonight. These are your kids. This is your son or your daughter who comes in at 4 in the morning and has a tummy ache and needs attention, and you have to do it right away. Okay, so you're going to deal with the storm. That's just a fact of life. Okay, so urgent things are the things you have to do. Now, what happened to your course while you're dealing with the urgent things? Well, chances are good that you're not on course anymore. So what do? Well, as soon as things calm down, take a fix. Where am I? Where is Jamaica? Okay. Oh, Jamaica is 100 degrees to the right. Well, let's turn course and resume navigation to Jamaica. Okay. And so, the idea is, navigation and course corrections, this is just kind of a fact of life. Okay. Certainly that's true when you're on the high seas. Now, how do we do this when we're trying to get things done in, our private lives or at work? Okay. Well, this is where the concept of coaching comes in and proves to be really useful. So when we talk about getting the right things done, there are basically three things that you need to do. Okay. And you see this, by the way, in the Scrum team, the development team, or the group that used to be known as the development team, they do the work. Okay. Now, when we're talking about something that you're going to use in the context of an individual, there really is just you. Maybe, an Eisenhower can delegate things as general of the army or as president, but, you and I, we have to do the work ourselves. Okay. The next aspect is setting priorities. Okay. So, if you've got too much to do, which work needs to get done? Which one are you going to do first? If you're not going to do something, which one should that be? And the next aspect is asking yourself questions. Now, this is not the Inquisition, but this is trying to, make sure that you're on course. So, am I working according to priority? Have I set the right priorities? Okay, this is kind of the role that the Scrum Master has. Setting priorities is more the role of the product owner, and I think Scrum really nailed it with this division of labor, because that helps you do a lot of things. Now, what if you don't have a whole team? What if it's just you? Well, this is where you can use some powerful questions to help you out. And the first question is, what really matters? Okay, this is about creating clarity of purpose. Now, very often people don't know what really matters. It may even take them a while to figure it out. But once you have the answer to that, it gives you context either for evaluating the answers to the next questions or deciding how you want to answer the next questions. So, second question is, what did you do last week? What did you get done? Okay, and this is that dotted line from where you were to where you are. Okay, so this is showing you what is your course moving forward. It's telling you where you are, where you're coming from, and that then gives you a hint about where you're going to. And you can use that information to make sure that you're on course to achieve your long-term goals. The next question is, what could I do this week? Okay, now we don't call it a to-do list. We don't call it, there's no obligations in it. I know I've got too much to do. I can't possibly do everything, but I still want to get the picture of what they are. And then the next step is to start doing triage. Well, which of those things are important? Which of them are urgent? And which of them are going to make me happy? Okay, and that last question is kind of an interesting one, because yes, we're not here just to serve customers or just to serve other people. We ourselves are a fully valued member in this transaction. And in fact, if you're not happy, if there's this deep divergence between who you are and who you want to be or who you feel you should be, that actually impacts your ability to do other things, be that at home or in the office. Okay, so you start reflecting on what could you do, triage based on what's important, what's urgent, what's going to make you happy, and that gives you a basis in the context of what really matters for choosing what you want to do this week. Okay, what can you expect to get done? What do you really want to get done this week? What is most important for whatever reason to get done this week? Now, the last question is, who can help? Okay, and who can help? This is there to help you get unstuck. Sometimes you might not have the skills to do something. Sometimes you might not be able to figure out how to do it, but you can ask yourself questions like, what would Elon Musk do? Okay, what would my father do? Okay, what would my teacher do? Okay, who can help me on this? And it's a very good, sometimes that person will actually be the person who you go to for help. Sometimes you might even pay the money to help you, in the sense of hiring a service. But this is a placeholder for a variety of things that'll help you get unstuck. Okay, so personal agility is really this simple framework. It consists of the 6 questions, and then once a week you do what we call celebrate and choose. Celebrate what you got done. Okay. Yes, your boat might have ended up at a slightly different place than you thought it was going to end up, but hey, you're the captain of the boat, you get to decide, and the boat hasn't sunk. Okay, that's always something worth celebrating. If you talk to the folks in the Navy, they say, nothing sank, nobody lost, good day. Okay, uh, everything else is a benefit. Okay, and when you're sailing a sailing ship all the way to Jamaica, um, the trick is to arrive. So you celebrate what you got done, and then based on where you are, you say, okay, what are we going to do next week? You choose what you'd like to do moving forward. So the idea is, last week you were somebody, you got some stuff done, that made you who you are today. Next week, you're going to get some other stuff done, and that should take you a step closer to what you want to achieve or who you want to be. So these are the questions. How do you process the answers? We use, like every other Agile practice, we suggest using an information radiator. What you're seeing here is the paper version. The breadcrumb trail, this is like Hansel and Gretel leaving a trail of breadcrumbs to find their way out of the forest. This tells you where you're coming from and helps you predict where you're going. The priorities map is for that triage process, that choosing, okay, what you want to do moving forward. Now, if you're familiar with Scrum or Kanban, the biggest difference is that first column, the what really matters column, because what we do is we make visible what you really care about. We're trying to create that clarity of purpose, okay? And that gives you context. You notice how all of the tickets are color coded? Well, what they're doing is we're mapping those tickets back to something that really matters. And that helps you make decisions about how you want to spend your time. And it also helps you recognize how you've been spending your time. And if there are any discrepancies between what you believe is important and how you're spending your time, well, you can recognize that and make course corrections in the coming week. Now, it turns out this concept of clarity of purpose, or what we call really matters, this scales beautifully from explaining things to your spouse to running a large organization. And I want to give you an example of a large project that was able to organize itself entirely around 3 sentences. Now, some of you may recognize the rocket that's sitting here on the launch pad. That's Apollo 11. I believe it's Apollo 11. It's that Saturn V, basically getting ready to launch to the moon. Now, President Kennedy called the space race to life in 1961. By mid-1969, 8 years later, the United States landed 2 men on the moon and brought them back safely to Earth. Now, Kennedy's speech at, I believe it was Texas A&M, it might have been Rice, I forget. Anyway, his speech in Texas is cited, when we talk about, how do you make, how do you share a vision? Okay, we talk about Kennedy's approach. Now, 2 years ago, I had the privilege of listening to former astronauts, former mission controllers, and former administrators on both sides of the space race, talking about why the Americans won the space race against the Soviets. And it turns out that the American project had a very clear purpose and a clear sense of unity. And no, they didn't come out and say this, but it was almost like a mantra. I heard these things over and over again. Everybody in that project basically knew 3 things, okay? The first thing is, we are going to the moon. Second point, it's not going to fail because of me. Third point, if anything goes wrong, remember statement number 1, we're going to the moon. Okay, and these 3 statements, everybody had them, 40 years later, 50 years later, people were still repeating them. We're going to the moon and it's not going to fail because of me. Now imagine that you are a congressman, imagine that you are an astronaut, imagine that you are a supplier, the seamstresses making the spacesuits, okay? Everybody knew it's not going to fail because of me. That's how important the work was, okay? So you can apply that almost anywhere. Now, the next thing I'd like to talk to you about is focus, okay? And the importance of focus to your ability to do things quickly. Basically, focus enables speed. Now, the problem that we have, why do we have too much to do? Well, there is really unlimited demand, Okay, imagine you've got 3 managers. Each one of them wants something from you for their project. You're working, 25 to 35, 40% on 3 or 4 different projects. The sad reality is we have a certain amount of capacity. Now, we can stretch it a bit by working overtime. We can sacrifice food and sleep. Those are deals with the devil. They'll come back to bite you later. But even if you push that, sooner or later, you're going to come up on limits. So the capacity that we have is limited. The demand on our time is unlimited. So how do we respond to this? Well, since it's so difficult to say no, usually what we do is we say, well, we're going to multitask. Okay. And whenever I have a pause in one thing, I'm going to go work on something else. Now, this has the very pleasant side effect of keeping you busy. So you work like crazy, but you don't actually get anything done. Okay, why is that? Well, I'd like to give you a little speed comparison. Okay, now this is based on work. You'll find it cited in Jeff Sutherland's works. Jerry Weinberg basically presented as a hypothesis. Our speaker later this evening, Joe Justice, claims that he's got data to back this up, although I would really love to see it. And if there are any academics out there who'd like to do some research, this would be a great topic to really, get some empirical, scientifically validated proof. Having said that, there's a lot of empirical evidence which suggests that this is correct. So this is you working on one thing, a standardized task. You can get it done in a week. Now, what happens if you're working on 5 of those tasks at once? Well, first of all, things slow to a crawl because, well, everything is going at 1/5 the speed because you're dividing your time among the 5 things. But you've also introduced new stakeholders into the process, and you've actually created new tasks, deciding what to work on next. Okay, so all of that contributes to the overhead. The model suggests that for every additional task you take on, you lose 20% of your effective capacity. By the time you're doing 5 things at once, 3/4 of your time is lost to the transaction cost. So it takes you nearly half a year to do what you could have done in a week. Okay, and this makes you very, very slow. Now, let's come back to the challenges of a volatile world. What happens when your planning rhythm is much slower than the volatility of the markets that you're working in? Okay, this is a huge disadvantage. Okay, but notice what happens when you focus. Okay, when you focus, you become much faster, and you can start to catch in these rhythms. You can plan and execute and then respond to changes on a very short cycle. Okay, now there's another problem with this, which is a bit more insidious. Because you're working so hard and you're under so much pressure to get things done, you don't have time to stop and think. Okay, now Jeff Sutherland points out correctly, every line of code you write, every bit of effort of time that you put in to create something, that costs you money. Some of those things bring you value. And the problem is, if you're running too hard, you don't have time to ask yourself the question, which of the stuff that I'm doing brings value and which of the stuff doesn't. So focus enables speed, enables you to stay with the rhythm of a volatile market. And the last thing that I'd like to point out is the importance of being nice to yourself. Now, we've heard in the retrospective prime directive, we assume that everybody's doing the best we can. Unfortunately, starting with ourselves, we don't always act if that's true. So one of the things which I'd like to do is I'd like to redefine the word resource. Now, this is something I got from my wife, who actually did a training as a therapist. And for them, a resource, it's a source of energy. It's a source of power, that gives you the strength to deal with hard times, okay, and gives you energy and desire to get up and going. And so one of the key questions, when someone comes in for a therapy is, what are your resources? What makes you happy? Okay, so I'm going to give you a couple of very small, modest suggestions. The first one, breathe. Okay, just breathing can bring you down. Make sure you get enough rest and exercise. There was an article out there about corporate athletes. If you're not in good shape, if you're not able to perform, you can't do good work for others. Be kind to yourself. You're getting far more done than you think you are. And make sure that every week you're doing something to make yourself happy. You'll feel better for it, and you'll get better work done for you and your stakeholders and your companies, etc. So with this, I would like to say thank you very much for the time that you've given me and for the attention that you've brought. It has been an honor to speak here. If you're curious and would like to find out more, we have a worldwide network of ambassadors. I'd like to encourage you to reach out to one of them. In particular, I'd like to point out that both Jim and Sriram are both ambassadors, and I'm sure they'd love to talk to you either online or offline. And at this point, I'm going to say thank you very much and invite questions.
Two pieces of information. I practice this myself, and this is very effective. And also, I actually have done a personal agility, a little mini course in the company I work with doing the transformation. This is the piece that's missing. You know, we do a lot of transformations. We don't focus on the people. So thank you, Peter, for presenting this.
Thank you, Jim.
Yep.
Thanks a lot, Peter. I completely vouch for the same thing. Again, I also practice this constantly on myself, and you will see a lot of information that I've already written about this. If anybody is interested, want to know more, please connect either with Jim or myself.
What next is Peter? Where do you see this movement go?
Personal agility?
Yep.
When I look at our case studies, okay, we have case studies of startup CEOs achieving their, target valuations in half the time that they thought, while getting their lives back and, and actually be able to have a normal life because they've been able to trust their executive team. I've seen people really just struggling to get by. There was just, one of these studies, how many people in the US can handle an unexpected $400 bill or $1,000 bill, like for a medical bill or something like that. And the numbers are scary. It's more than a third. There was just another study, it's a real people. A lot of people are really struggling. We have a case study of a woman who was, in that, 6 jobs, including working for Uber, who was able to get that behind her and put the toxic relationships behind her and establish her business and earn a solid middle class living. We have lots of case studies of, I'll call them, middle-aged, 30s and 40s, people leaving companies and becoming independent, managing the challenges of, well, a lot of women in this case, actually, managing the challenges of family, husband, new work, new business. The business, you're not just working in the business, you're also working on the business. How do I manage all that? We've got cases of students managing themselves to finish their graduation. I deeply believe this is going to be universally useful. I do believe that this is going to be a gateway to agility, especially for executives. One of the problems that many executives have is that, this agile stuff, it almost feels like a foreign language because, executives don't usually work as part of development teams. And so they're saying, what does this agile stuff have to do with me? I don't work in a team. I'm by myself. I'm responsible, not just for a team, but for a whole division. And it turns out that, executives, their most precious commodity is their time. Okay. And even with senior executives, you ask them, well, how much of your time is really bringing value to your organization and how much of it is just busy work? Okay. Or stuff that doesn't bring value. And even for senior executives, wow, I wish I could spend my time more valuably. And then so you get an executive who starts doing this and they say, oh, wow, this really helps. And then all of a sudden, they're showing their priorities maps to their colleagues. And now they're leading by example. They're an authentic example. And the cases that I've seen where this has happened, agility spreads like wildfire in the companies because all of a sudden you've got an influential role model. Everybody understands why it works. And all of a sudden, what used to be a foreign language that no one understands, becomes logical and almost self-evident. Okay, So, to answer your question, I think it's going to be everywhere. And I think it's also going to make, the transition to much more agile companies going to be much, much easier.
Yeah,
Now, I'm a little bit biased on that, but I'll pass that one on to Jim and to Sriram, who might have a better perspective than I do.
I actually did this with the management team in the company I'm working at, and there was a lot of, oh yeah, okay, I get this. Oh, this makes sense. Wow, we never thought of it this way. So I think from an industry perspective, as personal agility takes on more stature, I think what we're going to see is agile coaches will need to get trained in this, and really be up to date on how this is done. It's a very important thing. Right?
Yeah.
Quick question. When you work with people, do you think about it as an ongoing Kanban kind of flow, or do you encourage people to kind of stop and evaluate what's going on in kind of a Scrum iterative way?
Good question.
If you look at that's a really good question. If you look at personal agility and how it came to be, you will find a lot of personal Kanban in it. You'll find a lot of Scrum in it, and you'll find powerful questions in it. Okay, I think those are the three strongest and most direct influences to what I was doing here. The problem that I had with personal Kanban and why I felt the need to go beyond it is, personal Kanban has got two really good principles. The first one is visualize, and the second one is limit your work in progress. Where I found that personal Kanban wasn't giving me the help that I needed is my problem wasn't the work in progress so much as the backlog. My backlog was too big, okay? And so, I was always, no matter what I did, there was always more backlog. One of our first executive case studies, when he started doing personal agility, what he realized is I want to end every week with satisfaction and start every week with confidence. And what that meant for him was getting real binary about what comes into his backlog for the week and what doesn't, because he really wanted to have his backlog empty at the end of each week. Okay, and so this is why when we look at our case studies, a lot of them are really transformational. Okay, people getting from in some cases a really desperate situation to a very strong situation, because we're asking and really focused on that what really matters question. Okay, now some of you might be thinking, but shouldn't we be starting with why? And the answer is yes, we do. So we start with why. Why are we doing personal agility? What is the change that you want to achieve in yourself, in your company, in your organization, whatever your context is? What are you trying to make happen? Okay, and that is, if you will, the destination. And then what really matters? This is an enumeration. This is making it tangible and actionable. What really matters to achieve that deeper why. Okay, and this makes it possible for you to make decisions on a day-to-day basis about how to use your time effectively, or how to make other decisions that are kind of in alignment with the bigger picture.